In my last lecture, I looked at several images of the human body made by women who were asking viewers to rethink the way they directed their gaze. This artist, while also a woman, deliberately chooses not to emphasize the gender of her figures, hence the title's reference to the term androgynous. So what message do you think the artist is sending with these dramatic, incomplete figures? Bodies without skulls, bodies without heads, torsos without legs? And why are they hollow? Well, to start with the last question, Epica saw her family home attacked by Nazis and then seized by Soviet occupiers. So here's a quote from the artist about that experience. I quote, "As our home and countryside receded, I felt increasingly hollow, as if my insides had been removed, and the exterior, unsupported by anything, shrank, losing its form." So this short video clip not only talks about Magdalena Epica's background, but also gives you a look at some of her early work. The artist spent some time working in a hospital and later studied human anatomy. This experience may offer another reason for her rather strange choice of medium. Pieces of coarse burlap, which she sewed and pieced together, bonding the sculpture with synthetic resin. The rough texture captures some of the look of internal organs, muscles, and veins. Here again are the artist's own words. Quote, "After many years, soft things of complicated tissue have become my material. I feel a kinship with the world which I do not want to know but through touching, feeling, and relating to the part of myself which I carry deep inside me." In another interview, she refers to, quote, "man's horrible powerlessness against the biological structure." So this is quite a different look at the body. Here's another set of works that captures this effect with the burlap and the resin particularly well. In fact, I think the College Board's chosen example of Epica's work leaves out an important element of her work and of her message. Usually, her hollowed out and incomplete human figures appear in large anonymous groupings. Because she hand molds each figure, each individual sculpture is unique, and yet the impression is one of being lost in an anonymous crowd. Here again is the explanation from the artist. Quote, "I happened to live in times which were extraordinary, times of collective hate and collective adoration. Crowds worshipped leaders, apparently great and good, who soon became mass murderers. So perhaps our androgynous figures are not merely victims, but also perpetrators of global tragedy." Let me just note that she sometimes casts her work in bronze. Here's a recent example in the same distinctive style. So you know the drill. What 3 things do you want to remember about this work? Well, I was drawn to this painting immediately, to its vivid, expressionist use of colors and the sense of movement and energy that I get from the painting. I got even more excited about this work when I learned more of its story, the story of its 84-year-old painter. Emily, I'm sorry, I'm going to butcher her last name, so I'm going to rudely use her first name, was born at the beginning of the 20th century and grew up in a remote desert area of Australia's outback in a community known, perhaps some would say ironically, as Utopia. I've circled Utopia on the map of Australia and included a photo on the bottom right. That dirt road is the main highway to and through her community. As your reading noted, European settlers established huge cattle stations in the outback, and once nomadic Aboriginal peoples were resettled forcibly on these farms, where they herded cattle and sheep for the European owners. The Aboriginal people only regained rights to the land in 1976, and by the way, our artist was deeply involved in the fight to pass what came to be known as the Aboriginal Land Act of 1976. She and other of her members of her clan performed an awelye ceremony before a bush hearing of the Land Claim Tribunal. And in this, they demonstrated the powerful nature of art as evidence for showing their connection to the country, to their land. The ceremony involved retelling Dreamtime creation stories and also involved body painting. I've included a photo on the right. It's not the actual ceremony that she was involved in. So for virtually 2/3 of her life, Emily had only occasional contact with the outside world. It was not until she was about 80 that she became almost overnight an artist of national and international standing. But she had long had great standing with her own community, serving as an elder for people and as a lifelong custodian of the women's dreaming sites in her clan country, Al-Kahari. Since this whole concept of dream time, or the time of creation, is so central to Aboriginal people's worldview and to our required work of art, I want you to watch this video clip. You'll also get a glimpse of the landscape that our artist captured, especially the landscape after the onset of the rainy season, when greenery comes to an otherwise dry landscape. In 1978, Aboriginal women began making batik cloth based on traditional Aboriginal earth and body paint designs. And this was actually a government-sponsored education program. It was designed to help the women find a source of income, and it was also intended to demonstrate the economic viability of these outstations to bolster their moral claim to the land. So here you see a collection of batiks from Utopia hanging on the left, and on the right, one of Emily's own batik designs. Now, these highly original designs quickly caught the eye of art dealers, and by 1988, the Utopia Women's Batik Co-op had more than 80 members. In an effort to expand the market for their art and the economic base of these very poor communities, a gallery in Sydney, Australia, provided acrylic paint and canvases to these women. 2 weeks later, the curators of the gallery returned to Utopia, and this is what they found. Works such as these. This is Emily's first painting, created when she was almost 80 years old. As your homework reading notes, this work was selected for the cover of the exhibition catalog, really as a gesture of respect for the artist's seniority. She was the oldest artist from the community. So Emily went on to produce over 3,000 paintings in the course of an 8-year painting career. In 2007, Earth's Creation became the first work by a female Australian artist and the first Aboriginal artwork to break the $1 million mark at an art auction. You see the news story here. The painting captures the artist's vision of Earth's creation and its recreation each year as the rains bring new life to a parched landscape. The technique she and other Aboriginal acrylic painters use is called dump dot. In other words, raw stripes or dots of paints are placed, really smeared into the surface. So here's another short video clip that gives a more complete description of the method. You'll note it's really a kind of action painting. So this isn't required, but I thought it was interesting. This is one of the last paintings that Emily made before her death. Note that her technique is continuing to evolve. One art blog I visited compared this with the works of the New York School of Abstract Expressionists and conjectured that this was further evidence of Jung's collective unconscious. Remember that idea? It was important to many artists in the 20th century. Well, maybe so. So, what 3 things do you want to remember about this work? Talked about this work, admittedly only briefly, back in our Asian art unit, but you now have more global contemporary context for this work. Does it remind you of any of the works we have studied in this unit? It reminded me of this one. So what similarities and differences between these 2 works do you see? Similarities, I can't talk today, in content and also in form. Well, in terms of content, both are abstract renderings of nature with titles that suggest the elements of nature that inspired them. I didn't assign any textbook reading about this work, but a passage in Gardner's Art Through the Ages explains that Song Sunam was one of the founders of the Oriental ink movement in the 1980s, and that his work owes a lot to post-painterly abstraction, which you may recall is the same category into which most art historians place Frankenthaler's The Bay. Both artists employed a method that takes advantage of diffusion. In Frankenthaler's case, thinned paint on unprimed canvas. In Frankenthaler's case, diluted ink. In Song Sunam's work, diluted ink. So back when I was talking about Korean art, I mentioned the Korean artists were heavily influenced by artistic trends in China. Do you remember this Confucian-style portrait of a high-ranking Korean officer? And in Song Sunam's work, we can see something of a shout-out to Chinese landscape painting and the work of the literati. And by the way, there were literati, poet, painters in Korea as well as in China. So what similarities and differences do you see between these two ink techniques? Well, the Chinese work is clearly more detailed. It's made with brushstrokes, and that allows for more realism and perhaps more nuance. But both works rely on subtle gradations of shading that ink can provide. Both use a contrast between light and dark spaces to delineate space. Both have varying degrees of thickness of the ink, though, of course, Song Sunam does all this in a much more abstract fashion. Summer Trees also represented a movement within Korea, both to rediscover traditional artistic techniques and to reinvent Korean art along unique national but also contemporary lines. So it's worth remembering that Korea was occupied by Japan during World War II, invaded by China during the Korean War. So it's hardly, which is the 1950s, it's hardly surprising that Korean art took a somewhat nationalist turn in the 1960s. So I've put up the author's own explanation of his motives on the slide. Reading that, I got curious about Song Sunam's reference to Korean ink wash tradition, so I did a little research, and here are two of the images I found, all made almost 5 centuries apart. Unfortunately, I couldn't find an artist name for either work. So, what 3 things do you want to remember about this work? Okay, snark alert. Did we really need 2 female Japanese artists who've gotten rich marketing themselves and some of the tackier elements of pop culture? Okay, I'm done snarking for a minute. I talked about this work a little when we discussed Buddhist art. Amitabha, or Pure Land Buddhism, is an ancient branch of Buddhism. It's also today one of the most popular forms of Buddhism in East Asia and the most popular form in the United States. So essential elements of Pure Land Buddhism include the practice of chanting the name of the Amitabha Buddha with total concentration, trusting that by doing this, the chanter, the practitioner, will secure rebirth in the Pure Land, which is a place where it's much easier for a being to work toward enlightenment. Some cynical observers call Pure Land Buddhism Buddhism on the cheap, without as much effort. In many ways, it actually resembles Protestant Christian theology with its emphasis on faith rather than works. Some of the other elements of Amitabha Buddhism include, indeed, faith and trust in and a personal relationship with the Amitabha Buddha, who is regarded by Pure Land Buddhists as, in fact, a sort of savior. And finally, followers of the Amitabha Buddha believe in, again, this Pure Land paradise, sometimes called the Western Land paradise, a place that provides a stepping stone toward enlightenment and liberation. So here's a 13th century Tibetan rendition of the Amitabha Buddha with attendant bodhisattvas. And now we're back to our 21st century version, I guess late 20th century version. So what Buddhist imagery do we see in this work? Well, according to what I read, the elves might be bodhisattvas. They are certainly attendants. And by the way, the figure Mariko Mori is representing is a princess figure from Buddhist tradition, and I forgot to write that in my notes, so I don't remember the name. But this is also, she is in fact in the persona, in the costume, if you will, of a figure from Buddhist tradition. The lotus flower is a potent Buddhist symbol. Lotus blooms in stagnant, polluted water, and so it's seen as a symbol that beauty can prevail even amidst the ugliness of worldly desires and worldly distractions. The lotus blossom also symbolizes rebirth into paradise, that is, the Pure Land. Now, according to the Khan Academy essay you read for homework, the fantastical object, which to my mind and theirs resembles a playful futuristic spacecraft, that's a quote, with arms, may be a variation of a Tibetan stupa. You remember those were the sacred buildings that held relics of the Buddha around which people circumambulated. Well, Mariko Mori started off as a leader of the Japanese Kosupure craze for costume play, in which adolescents and adolescent adults use elaborate costumes and makeup to transform themselves into manga and anime figures. Cosplay has come to this country as well. I actually encountered a gang of teenagers dressed up in costumes when I was walking my dogs in a Palo Alto park just last weekend. I asked them what they were doing, and they answered cosplay. I had never heard that term before, and here I am needing it for today's podcast. Never say that we don't learn from students. So here are a couple of images of the artist from the mid-1990s. Mariko Mori actually began her career as a fashion model before attending art school. Most of her art seems to be images of herself, also a deliberate reflection on popular culture, but maybe a touch of self-promotion as well. You should think about how images of oneself are used. Hint, hint, you might need that for an essay. So I'm going to read from an also rather snarky review of Pure Land's opening at the Tokyo Museum of Contemporary Art in 2002. I quote, "Sometime around the middle of her career thus far, Mori morphed into a New Age Eastern goddess character. The transition began with The Shaman's Prayer, a 1996 video installation in which a futuristically costumed Mori dreamily caresses a crystal ball while standing in the then new Kansai International Airport." We can't miss that, can we? Let's watch a few seconds of this video, which is up on Moodle as well. And the figure you see in the video, by the way, is a cyborg. So I'm going to continue with the review. Mariko Mori's spiritual affectation, not perhaps a very nice choice of word, evolved in ambitious three-dimensional videos such as 1997's Nirvana, in which viewers don special glasses to watch Mori be born as of one of the 7 floating balls of light and flutters feathers outward from her fingertips. I think I may have copied something wrong there. At any rate, a droplet of, I'm guessing, life energy forms in Mori's midsection before floating off through the heavenly landscape which surrounds her. It returns to Mori and is sucked back inside her. The remaining balls of light, meanwhile, become little pastel-hued pixies, or elves, and one plays a mandolin while the others make cute little squeaking sounds and hover around their beloved Mori, who is dressed in a flowing silk kimono and, as we see on the right, can fly. Everyone dissolves into the cosmos. Finally, stars shoot out of the screen and over the audience. End quote. Well, since the College Board obviously thinks this is an important work of art, I'm going to continue by reading part of a more flattering review. Quote, "Mori is fascinated by the way contemporary Japanese society balances technology, fantasy, and humanity. With an affectionate perspective on her native country, she explodes the way fantasy and reality overlap in contemporary Japanese consciousness. Here is a world where cartoon characters step out of comic books to stalk the real streets, and real people withdraw from their grim routine to lose themselves in cartoon fantasies." End quote. This is a McConnell edition. Maybe it involves spiritual seeking as well. So here's the artist's own explanation from an interview she gave to the Journal of Contemporary Art. The artist said, quote, "When I went back to Japan after a long stay here, that is in New York, I thought that the youth culture in Japan was most energetic. Up to then, culture in Japan consisted of Western simulations and fakes imported from abroad. I was absorbed and stimulated. They were original and so powerful." Mariko Mori added, the interview was recorded just before she produced the work we're studying, "My work is heading toward more public performance and fantasy. I am making an enlightenment capsule for the audience to meditate inside, virtual reality in which people can experience ancient ideas from the East." Okay, guys, confession time. I am way out of my comfort zone here. I have never engaged in cosplay. I've never even been to any of those superhero movies that are flooding the theaters. I don't get anime. I find both of these artists amazingly and frankly irritatingly narcissistic. But they are both enormously popular. They've both captured something in our culture that draws many, many people to their art, and they are both taken seriously by important people in the art world. So I'm going to close this podcast by opening a discussion, really by throwing the whole question back at you. What do you think about these artists? Is this great art? Is it important art? And yes, of course, what 3 things do you want to remember about the work on top?